I hit rock bottom 3 times in 6 months. Each time I thought I'd found the floor, it vanished beneath me. First, I lost my job at the lumber mill when half the workforce got automated overnight. Then, 2 weeks later, I was evicted. My pride went missing somewhere between the moving truck and my aunt's spare bedroom in Cotter, Arkansas. At 28, I was back in the place I grew up, sleeping under a leaky roof while my aunt's reminders of my failures fell like constant rain. Desperation made me desperate enough to answer a handwritten ad on a corkboard at the Piggly Wiggly. Night caretaker wanted at Raven's Hollow Cemetery. Cash pay. No questions asked. I didn't ask questions. I called the number and a raspy voice answered. Meet Jasper Crow at the cemetery. Gates, dusk. Come alone. The directions led me down twisting dirt roads surrounded by pine forests so thick the afternoon sun barely penetrated. I knew these woods. I'd spent my childhood fishing the spring river and hunting through these exact trees. But I'd never seen Raven's Hollow before. The cemetery appeared suddenly as the road curved, and I slammed the brakes a little too hard. Dust rose in clouds around my tires. The iron gates were taller than 10 feet, twisted into shapes that had probably been decorative once, now warped and tortured by decades of rust. Beyond, the headstones spread like a sea of grey under a canopy of oak tree. Shadows so thick that twilight seemed permanent, even though the sun still clung to the horizon. A man stood by the gates, and even from the truck, I knew something was wrong. He looked too angular, too brittle, like the sun and wind had carved him into a skeleton, dressed in canvas pants and a flannel shirt. His hands trembled as he pulled out a ring of keys. "You Arlo Finch?" he asked, his pale blue eyes flicking constantly from me to the cemetery, then over my shoulder. "That's me." "You know anything about caretaking?" "I can follow instructions. I'm good with my hands. I need the work." He nodded like he expected nothing else. "Pays 200 a week. Cash. Midnight to 6 a.m., 6 nights. 1 night off. You work the hours, follow the rules. You stay in the shed unless something requires your attention." "What kind of rules?" "You'll see. Start tomorrow." He unlocked the gates with a shriek that sent crows scattering. "Follow them exactly, or, well, it won't end well." I didn't know what he meant, but the pay was enough to keep a roof over my head. That night, I drove back to my aunt's place, replaying the encounter in my mind. The cemetery was fatalized, older than I expected. Some headstones were completely illegible, half buried, tilted at odd angles. Others carried the same surnames I knew from town, dates clustered around 1878. Jasper mentioned yellow fever, an epidemic that killed over 100 people in 3 weeks. Some graves here had been stacked with bodies until the receiving tomb overflowed. The shed was small but serviceable. A cot, a space heater, a rust-stained sink, and a small desk with a flashlight and a clipboard. Jasper handed me a typed sheet. Raven's Hollow Cemetery, Night Caretaker Rules. Rule 1. Between 2 and 2:30 a.m., you may hear bluegrass music from Section 3. Do not investigate, do not acknowledge it. Stay inside. Rule 2. If wildflowers appear on the hallway tomb, Section 4, burn them immediately with the kerosene provided. Every petal must be ash. Rule 3. Receiving tomb in Section 5 must remain locked. Check locks during 4 a.m. rounds. Rule 4. Between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m., do not leave the shed under any circumstances. Voices calling your name must be ignored. Rule 5. If anyone asks for directions, do not answer. Walk away. Do not make eye contact. Rule 6. If fog rises from the river, Section 6. Stay inside until it clears. Do not let it touch you. I read through the rules twice and looked up. Jasper's pale eyes bore into mine. You'll wake it, and it's always hungry. I didn't know what he meant, but the warning sent a shiver down my spine. Something in the way he said it made the hair on my neck rise, not ghosts. Something else. The first 3 nights were quiet. I patrolled the grounds at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Flashlights slicing through darkness, so complete it felt solid. The music never played, no flowers appeared, and the fog never rolled in. I convinced myself the rules were superstition, relics of a small town afraid of its past. Night 4 changed everything. At 2:17 a.m., bluegrass drifted across Section 3. Live instruments played with precision. The notes too perfect, too alive. I froze. Shapes moved between the headstones. A dozen or more, swaying in unison as if the music commanded their bodies. I should have turned away, should have followed Rule 1, but I couldn't. Then I saw it. A figure taller than the rest, rigid, unnatural, facing me despite the shadows. Its posture was wrong in ways I couldn't explain. My flashlight felt heavy in my hand. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape the presence pressing against me. Yet I stayed. 30 minutes passed, then the music stopped. Silence settled over the cemetery like a suffocating fog. I didn't sleep that night. The fifth night, flowers grew on the hallway tomb again. White petals with yellow centers, too sweet, almost mocking. I burned them with the kerosene. Flames erupted green, luminescent and sickly, the smell like ozone and wet earth. A pulse of attention washed over me, centered on the mausoleum at the cemetery's heart. Something stirred beneath the ground, ancient, patient, aware. By night 6, I needed to see the mausoleum. I stayed just beyond the iron door, examining the carvings. Figures in procession, heads bowed. The tallest at the front, grinning. The smile was too wide. Teeth grey as tombstones. Every night following the rules felt like participating in some ritual I barely understood. By the seventh night, during the silent hour, I heard my mother calling from outside. She'd been dead for 3 years. Rule 4 echoed in my head. I stayed. Understanding came suddenly. The cemetery wasn't haunted by the dead. It was a feeding ground. The rules weren't for protection. They were preparation. Each night I worked, I inched closer to becoming the vessel for whatever slumbered beneath Raven's Hollow. 3 nights later, fog rolled from Section 6. I began my rounds, but noticed a man standing at the edge, asking directions. His head twisted impossibly to face me, mouth stretched into a smile too wide, teeth cracked and gray. My body moved on instinct alone. I ran. The shed became a sanctuary as the fog pressed against it, alive and patient. On night 11, the pull grew unbearable. I had followed every rule, yet the music, the flowers, the fog, all reminded me that compliance might only delay the inevitable. The entity was learning about me, my fears, my attachments. It had chosen me, and when it did, it would walk the world through me. Night 12 began like any other, the darkness crawling through the oak branches outside the shed window. I sat on the cot, staring at the clipboard with rules I no longer fully understood but had followed to the letter. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying scents of wet earth and something older, metallic. I thought about Jasper Crow and how his pale eyes had held more knowledge than he ever shared. He hadn't lied. The rules were precise. But survive meant more than following instructions. It meant understanding what I was protecting myself from. At exactly 2:03 a.m., I heard the faint scraping of boots on gravel. My flashlight cut through the shadows as I scanned the perimeter. Nothing, just the rustling of leaves. Then the blue grass began, soft like a lullaby, drifting over Section 3. I froze. body tensing like a coiled spring. I shouldn't have looked, shouldn't have let curiosity push me forward, but the notes tugged at something deep in my memory. Childhood afternoons, riverbanks, the smell of my father's whiskey on cool mornings. I pressed my eyes shut. When I opened them again, the music was gone. I waited, pulse hammering, sweat prickling my skin. By 3:15 a.m., the silence became oppressive. Shadows shifted across the cemetery as if the ground itself breathed. I checked the doors, locks secure. Rule 4. Do not leave the shed, replayed in my mind. Still, the pull toward the mausoleum grew stronger. I could feel it like a heartbeat under the earth, slow and deliberate. Every instinct told me to stay inside, yet I moved, flashlight trembling in hand, boots crunching softly on frost-hardened soil. Section 4 greeted me with flowers, the same white petals with yellow centers. I hadn't seen them the night before. Rule 2. Burn them immediately. I hesitated, staring at their delicate forms, almost pleading with me. A shiver ran down my spine as the smell of ozone and wet earth filled my nostrils. The flames burned green, brighter than before, and a low hum vibrated beneath the ground. It was waiting, aware, reacting. I realized then that compliance alone was not enough. I had to act decisively. The mausoleum doors loomed in the distance, carved with figures that seemed to move in the corner of my vision. I approached slowly, flashlight focused, noticing the tallest figure at the front, the grinning one. Its smile seemed to widen every time I blinked. And then I heard it. My name, whispered softly, carried on the wind. Arlo. Arlo. It came from beneath the ground, from the walls of the tomb, from the trees themselves. My heartbeat spiked. Rule 4. Ignore it. I forced my feet to obey. Night 13 was worse. The fog rolled from Section 6, thick and clinging to everything it touched. I stayed in the shed, watching it coil around gravestones, tendrils of mist creeping closer to the foundation. Voices echoed through the haze, some calling my name, others whispering secrets I wasn't supposed to hear. The wind carried fragments of conversations from decades past, arguments, confessions, pleas. The cemetery was alive, a vessel for all who had walked there, all who had been buried. I realized the rules weren't just instructions. They were a way to keep the balance, to prevent the dead and whatever else slept beneath from claiming me entirely. By night 14, I had started leaving small offerings. A flashlight at the base of the mausoleum steps, a circle of salt around the hallway tomb, a piece of my own hair tied to a fence post in Section 5. Jasper had never told me about this, but instinct guided me. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to notice. Sometimes I'd catch shadows retreating just as I arrived, as if acknowledging my presence but respecting my compliance. Still, the pull grew stronger every night, a weight pressing against my chest, whispering, always whispering. I started to notice the crows, hundreds, maybe thousands, perched in the trees, circling overhead, their calls deafening at times. They were not ordinary birds. They moved with purpose, watching, warning, sometimes following me across the grounds. One night, a single crow landed on the shed roof and stared directly at me. Its eyes glowed faintly, unnatural, like embers. I froze, unable to look away, until it lifted off silently and vanished into the fog. The 15th night, the entity reached out more directly. I woke to the shed door shaking violently, rattling against the frame. The air smelled of damp soil and iron. Something pressed against the walls, heavy, patient. I could hear it breathing. Or perhaps it was the ground, the earth itself inhaling. I remembered Rule 6. If the fog touches you, you don't leave. I held my ground, clutching the flashlight, knees trembling, sweat soaking my shirt. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving me trembling in silence. I began mapping the cemetery in my head, noting patterns, safe zones, areas where the pull of the entity was strongest. Section 3, Section 4, Section 5, Section 6. Each held a distinct presence. I realized the music, the flowers, the fog, even the crows were all part of a system, a ritual framework I had to navigate. Ili meant more than death. It meant becoming a conduit, a host, a voice for the thing below Raven's Hollow. Night 16. I broke the rules. I left the shed. Just a step, just to see. The fog wrapped around me instantly, cold and thick, seeping into my pores. I saw figures in the mist, outlines of people from photographs I didn't remember taking, faces familiar yet impossible. They whispered, not my name, but others. Names of people I had never met. I ran back to the shed, panting, heart hammering. The rules weren't just precautions. They were barriers. Jasper didn't return after the 3rd week. I realized he had trained me, tested me, then abandoned me to learn, to adapt, to survive. There would be no rescue, no intervention, only me, the rules, and the ancient patient presence beneath the soil. I understood then why he said it was always hungry. The entity waited for the smallest mistake, the tiniest lapse in compliance. Night 17, I started hearing the whispers even in my dreams. I awoke in cold sweat, flashlight in hand, to see the mausoleum doors slightly ajar. I had never opened them, never touched them. A wind that didn't belong blew from inside, carrying the faint scent of burned flowers and earth turned over. Something wanted me to look. Something wanted me to step inside. My body shook, but the rules echoed in my mind. Do not enter. Stay alive. By night 18, I realized survival was about more than following instructions. It was about understanding. Watch the patterns of the fog. Listen to the intervals of the music. Timed the growth of the flowers. Each night, I adapted, responded, and sometimes I anticipated. I learned to move silently, to avoid attention, to respect the boundaries set by something far older and more intelligent than I could comprehend. And still, the pull grew stronger. Night 19 arrived like a predator stalking its prey, dragging shadows across the cemetery with each passing hour. I had begun to memorize the subtle signs, the way the fog shifted before something moved, the faint vibrations in the ground, the distant flapping of the crow's wings. I moved cautiously among the gravestones, flashlight slicing through the mist, illuminating cracked marble and moss-covered statues that seemed to lean toward me, watching. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a possible threat. I kept thinking about Jasper's pale eyes and the faint grin he wore when handing me the first rules. He had known I'd survive, but only if I paid attention, only if I truly understood. By midnight, I had reached Section 6. The fog here was thicker, almost tactile, wrapping around my boots, curling at my knees, ghosting across my arms like tendrils of ice. The whispers had grown louder, forming sentences now, fragmented and sinister. You belong. You're next. Obey. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through my skull. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the words still found me. My body wanted to run, but my mind reminded me, movement without thought is death. The flowers had returned, white and glistening in the flashlight's beam. Rule 2. Burn immediately. I knelt, placing them carefully in the small metal container I had fashioned for such purposes. The flames erupted green again, brighter than ever, casting twisted shadows against the mausoleum walls. The shadows moved unnaturally, almost like smoke with intention, twisting and writhing as if alive. I stepped back, clutching the edges of the container, heart hammering. Rule 7. Never let them touch your skin. The smoke, if I could call it that, brushed my arm lightly. I flinched, shaking the container violently. It recoiled, and for a moment, silence. That was when I noticed the crows were silent. Hundreds of black silhouettes perched in the trees, still and watchful, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to falter. I realized then that the crows were not merely watchers. They were messengers, perhaps extensions of the entity itself, monitoring the limits of my compliance. Any misstep would be reported, any hesitation noted. By 1:47 a.m., I had circled the mausoleum twice, tracing patterns in the fog to understand its rhythm. The whisper shifted into something intelligible, coherent. The caretaker learns. The caretaker obeys. The caretaker survives. For now, my stomach twisted. I wasn't just a passive observer. I was a participant in a game older than any memory I had. Older than Jasper, older than the cemetery itself. And I was still learning the rules. Night 20, I found a new rule scrawled in the dirt at the edge of section 4. Do not look beneath the stone that sinks. My breath caught. I had noticed a tombstone earlier that hummed softly. A vibration you could feel more than hear. Now the rule confirmed my suspicion. Curiosity was dangerous here. Even something as small as glancing too long could trigger consequences I wasn't prepared for. The line between life and death, compliance and defiance, had never been thinner. The fog thickened as I moved towards section 5. My boots sinking slightly into wet earth. Something shifted beneath the ground. I froze. The soil pulsed like a heartbeat, echoing through my body. A hand, no, several, pushed through the dirt, grasping at the night air. Rule 5. Never touch what reaches out. I stepped back, flashlight trembling, stomach knotting. The hands withdrew, leaving small clumps of dirt, as if testing my reactions, measuring my obedience. By 3:12 a.m., I realized I was being watched from within the mausoleum itself. The doors, which had always remained closed, now had faint scratches, almost like fingernails clawing outward. A shadow moved behind the glass, twisting, bending unnaturally. Rule 4. Do not enter. My throat went dry. Each instinct screamed to flee. Yet I held my ground, grounding myself in the knowledge that panic was what it wanted. The entity thrived on mistakes, feeding on fear and hesitation. Night 21 brought the first dream that felt real. I awoke to the scent of wet grass and rotting flowers, and for a moment I thought I was outside. But the shed was intact, my flashlight still by my side. A whisper drew me towards Section 3. My body obeyed, moving silently. But I realized the dream had bled into reality. I was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. The cemetery was a liminal space, a thin veil separating the living from the dead, the observer from the observed. By night 22, the entity grew more aggressive. The flowers now burned hotter, green flames licking higher than before. Shadows seemed to stretch toward me, unnaturally long, flickering across gravestones in impossible angles. The wind carried voices, pleading, begging, threatening. I began marking safe paths with stones and chalk, mapping a network of zones where I could navigate without drawing attention. Even then, mistakes were inevitable. Every movement had to be deliberate, every breath calculated. The crows were restless. They circled overhead, calling in harsh, guttural tones that reverberated through the mist. One crow landed on the mausoleum roof, eyeing me directly. Its beak tapped slowly against the stone, almost like a warning, almost like a counting mechanism. I froze, holding my flashlight steady, waiting for the signal, the rhythm to break. After what felt like an eternity, it spread its wings and vanished into the fog. Night 23. I broke another rule. I leaned too close to the singing stone, curiosity overtaking caution. The hum intensified, vibrating through my bones, and shadows erupted from the ground, writhing toward me. My flashlight fell to the earth with a clatter, and I stumbled back, heart racing. I had survived, but barely. Rule 5. Never look beneath the stone that sings. Lesson learned too late. By 2:56 a.m., I was back at the shed, panting, soaked in sweat, feeling the weight of the cemetery pressing down on me. The rules weren't just instructions. They were a lifeline. Each violation brought me closer to becoming part of the entity's domain, to losing myself beneath Raven's hollow. I knew then that survival meant mastery, not mere compliance. I had to anticipate, to understand, to outthink something that had existed long before me. Night 24. I began setting up small protective circles. Salt, chalk, burned petals, and whispered prayers became my arsenal. The entity tested them, brushing against their boundaries. probing weaknesses. The flowers burned green at the base of each circle, shadows flickering at possible angles. The crows perched silently, watching my every move. I realized I was no longer just reacting. I was learning, adapting, surviving with intention. By night 25, I had mapped the entire cemetery, memorizing every grave, every mausoleum, every zone of power and weakness. I had begun speaking to the fog, coaxing it, negotiating boundaries. Whether it understood or simply observed, I didn't know. But the movement of shadows became less aggressive, more calculated, as if acknowledging my growing competence. And yet, the pull never diminished. Night 26. The fog clung thicker than ever, suffocating, whispering promises and threats with equal fervor. I had learned every inch of Raven's Hollow, memorized every grave, every shadow's shift, every subtle hum beneath the stones. And yet, the cemetery had not relinquished its dominion. The air felt alive, charged with something older than memory, watching, waiting, always calculating. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the only constant in the shifting nightmare. Its beam carving temporary islands of safety in the dense, undulating fog. The crows had grown restless again, their piercing calls splitting the silence into jagged fragments. I recognized the pattern. Warnings, testing, intimidation. One landed near the singing stone, the same one that had nearly claimed me, and cocked its head as if to measure my shield. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. Never look beneath the stone that sings. My muscles tensed, the impulse to glance nearly overwhelming. But I clenched my jaw and stepped aside. Patience was survival. Restraint was survival. I had learned that much. The green flames of the burned flowers reflected off the mausoleum walls, twisting shadows into impossible angles. I had begun placing these small flames in strategic positions, creating pathways and protective circles. Each burn was calculated, a negotiation with the entity, a reminder that I was not entirely passive. The shadows writhed, stretching and recoiling around the flames, and I realized I was no longer merely surviving. I was manipulating the environment, learning its rules, establishing boundaries. But the cemetery demanded more than careful planning. It demanded vigilance. The whispers had grown into murmurs, sentences forming just beyond comprehension. Promises of knowledge, threats of eternal possession. I felt them in my bones, a pressure that marked each step deliberate. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted a circle of salt around the central tomb, the heart of the cemetery's power. Each circle was a silent declaration. I will not yield. I will endure. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog, a shape I recognized immediately. Jasper. His pale eyes glowed faintly, the ever-present grin stretched across his face. "You've learned much," he whispered, voice sliding over the fog like silk. "But there is always more." My heart thumped, fear and relief warring. "I don't need more," I said, voice steady, though my legs shook. "I just need to survive tonight." He tilted his head, observing me. The wind picked up, carrying the crow's cries in a cacophonous wave. "Survival is not enough," he said. "Understanding is." And with that, he vanished, swallowed by the fog, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. I understood what he meant. Survival without comprehension was fleeting. I needed to anticipate, to internalize the cemetery's logic, to become part of its rhythm without becoming a victim. The fog shifted again, denser now, swirling around the tombstones in a slow, deliberate dance. The crows took to the air, forming spirals above the mausoleum, their wings slicing through the mist like living blades. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, following a path I had memorized, navigating with precision. Every instinct screamed caution, every fiber of my body attuned to the entity's presence. I was not unafraid, but fear was no longer my master. Control was. Reaching the heart of the cemetery, I paused at the central tomb. The green flames burned brighter, shadows writhing around it like hungry tendrils. I could feel the power emanating from beneath the stone, the pulse of an ancient presence that measured my worth with every breath. I knelt, whispering a quiet affirmation of respect and warning. The shadows paused, the fog held, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of equilibrium. I knew then that surviving Raven's Hollow was not about avoiding mistakes. It was about learning its language, its rhythms, its limits. The rules were not punishments, but keys, each one unlocking a fragment of understanding. The cemetery demanded obedience, but it also rewarded mastery. The crows called again. The fog shifted, and I felt, for the first time, not hunted, but acknowledged. Dawn approached slowly, spilling pale light over the gravestones. The whispers faded, The crows retreated, and the fog lifted just enough for me to see the boundaries I had carved, the circles I had drawn, the fragile equilibrium I had achieved. I was exhausted, drained to the bone, but I had survived. Not merely survived, adapted, learned, endured. And as I stepped back toward the shed, the sun's first rays cutting through the mist, I understood the truth of Jasper's lesson. In Raven's Hollow, survival was fleeting without comprehension. The cemetery had claimed many, but tonight I was not one of them. For now, the caretaker remained. For now, I followed the rules.